Hello, guys. I'm Jose Mayubi, and today I am honored to speak with Professor Katharina Kraus and my co-host Guilherme. Guilherme, thank you so much to support this interview.
Thank you for having me. I'm Guilherme. I'm a philosophy undergraduate and economy undergraduate too. So I'll try to support this interview for Jose right now. Do anything I can to uh, help with the questions. And now Jose will present Professor Katharina Kraus.
So, guys, a brief introduction of Katharina to Kraus. Katharina Kraus is a professor of philosophy at Johns Hopkins University. Today, we will discuss your new book, Kant's Idea of Reason, and a little about our other book, Kant on Self-Knowledge and Self-Formation. Professor Katharina, now I speak German, but German is not so good, but I try my best. Sie Ehre Sie hier zu haben, Frau Professor Kraus.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me and for this kind introduction. And it's wonderful to meet you.
Okay. Katharina, Professor Katharina, sorry. What do you find most intellectually completely about Kant philosophy, and what motivates you to undertake the right of Kant's ideas of reason?
Yes, that's a big question, but of course an important one to begin with. So Immanuel Kant is one of these philosophers you cannot really avoid in German education, and that was also the case for me. So it's like reading Goethe. But I began to take a serious interest in Kant's philosophy early on in my studies of philosophy in Germany. So it was one of these typically German close reading seminars at the University of Heidelberg, where we were reading his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. And I was simply fascinated by the rigor and persuasiveness of his thought. So at the time, I was still studying the sciences, physics and mathematics, but I was soon drawn into philosophy. And as soon enough, Kant became one of the most important figures because he is this kind of figure, I think, which gives you an important point of reference. Like it gives my own philosophical thinking a point of orientation and direction. And what I appreciate most about Kant's philosophy is really its systematicity. So Kant brings together all areas of philosophy. He offers insightful conceptions and arguments for questions about knowledge and truth and nature and science, stuff we will talk about today in particular, but also, and maybe more importantly, about questions about morality, peace, justice, character, God, all these important questions in human life. And so this particular project on ideas of reason grew out of my earlier project on a specific idea, namely the idea of the soul, and which I think we will talk about a little bit in the end of this interview. So taking Kant's lead about systematicity, I kind of started seeing the ideas of reason playing a role everywhere in his philosophy. And I began asking myself, well, more systematically, what are these ideas? How could I interpret these ideas in a systematic way so that they fit into a complete picture? And would, in a way, my interpretation of the idea of the soul for inner experience also apply to the idea of the world whole, the idea of God, or other ideas? So in this kind of relatively short and thin book, I do not provide a complete answer, of course, but I kind of had to limit myself to theoretical ideas, the ideas of theoretical reason in particular, and I'm trying to understand their role in the production of knowledge for us. So maybe I should say a little word at the beginning about what are ideas of reason at all, because not many people will be familiar with this notion in Kant. As I said, it's hidden somewhere in the back of his critique of pure reason, and there it comes out for the first time. So an idea of reason is a concept of a whole. And with this conception of ideas of reason, Kant shifts our focus to a particular kind of mental capacity we have, namely to grasp something holistically, or to grasp the entirety, the totality of something. Like, for instance, the entire causal history, that leads up to an event, for example, the French Revolution, or the entire character of a human person. And this kind of holistic thinking is really something deeply fascinating for me. And I find it not really sufficiently reflected in contemporary, trimmed down accounts of rationality. So they are often, like, contemporary philosophy is often highly specialized and fragmented into subfields. And so I think this particular kind of holistic thinking often is not particularly addressed there. Yeah.
Guy, your microphone.
So, oh, right. Sorry. So moving on to the next question. Kant distinguishes three higher intellectual faculties: the understanding, the power of judgment, and reason, each having the distinctive task of governing their own domains. So, well, how can this Kantian framework still serve as a relevant lens for comprehending the complexities of human rationality today?
Yes. Well, every time I start explaining Kant complex philosophy and drawing a large diagram of the different faculties of the mind he distinguishes on the blackboard, my students get terribly confused that there are two intellectual faculties and not only one. There's the understanding and there's reason, and they seem to be doing two different things. And then there's another one, the power of judgment, that seems to play an important role. So it is first really hard to see why there is any purpose or any positive contribution in this very baroque categorization of the mind, and how it could possibly fit into a contemporary slimmed down account of rationality. So many students and colleagues probably trained in the analytic tradition are likely to question the use of this distinction. But I think, first of all, it is important to see that human rationality is a complex combination of different mental functions we are able to perform. And Kant's distinction between the understanding and reason in particular reflects two distinct intellectual tasks or modes of operation that we have available. Like, one mode we could call the discursive or process-oriented thinking, such as the adding of numbers one after the other, or the naming of what I immediately perceive, one after the other perception. The other mode is a more holistic, intuitive mode of grasping, such as grasping the truth of a complex mathematical proof, or the truth of a conclusion after a long, winding syllogistic argument. So the understanding performs the former, the process-oriented thinking, as it were, whereas reason takes on the latter, the more holistic grasping of a thing. And both faculties are important and insightful to us. Both have their specific domains or specific ways of operation. But importantly, neither of them is complete. So neither is complete without the other. And so an important conclusion of my book on ideas is that the understanding as this capacity to judge empirical objects cannot meaningfully operate without reason and its ideas. And so we fundamentally need both these modes of operation. But both these faculties are also prone to distinctive kinds of errors. So, for example, the tendency to overstep their boundaries, the bounds of sense. And this is one of the reasons why we need a further faculty, namely the power of judgment, which is in a way the faculty of applying these higher order faculties in specific contexts as human beings at a particular time or at a particular place in the universe.
Great answer, Professor Katharina Kraus. I have a question, the classical question about knowledge. What is this different in the Plato and Kant? That is, my question is, what role do ideas of reason play in Kant and Plato? Can you tell us a bit about the different views of these two philosophers?
Yes, that's right. Kant is often seen as standing in the Platonic tradition in some way, but it's unclear exactly how. And indeed, Kant refers directly to Plato when he introduces his technical term of ideas of reason. So Plato was definitely a source of inspiration for Kant, and that's important to note. But Kant also tries to set himself apart from Plato. So roughly speaking, their similarities and differences can maybe summarized as follows. Like both Plato and Kant introduce ideas as concepts of something whole, complete, ideal, or perfect. Kant, for example, cites Plato's idea of virtue, such as justice, which provides a perfect archetype for what is considered a virtue, what is considered just. Of course, no real life human being would ever be able to live up to this idea of virtue. But this idea is crucial, and it gives humans a moral compass or normative standards for their own moral orientation. This, I think, is what they have in common. But here's an important difference. For Plato, these ideas have a kind of reality, even a higher reality than the imperfect, virtuous behavior we see around us in human beings. So these ideas are true. These are the true reality made actual by a divine intellect in the highest sense. By contrast, Kant remains agnostic about their reality, or at least that is a controversial question we'll get to later. Nevertheless, Kant also wants them to play a regulative role as a normative standard, so they should guide human thought and action. But like so much in Kant, it's very complicated and still controversial. But in a way, the starting point of my project was to realize that there are two opposing tendencies in how to interpret ideas in Kant, a realistic and a normative tendency, both of which are present in the contemporary literature on Kant, and both of which are important to understand the full meaning of ideas of reason. So both strands are reflected, and I call them the nominalist and the fictionalist reading. So very briefly, the fictionalist reading emphasizes this realist strand, that ideas refer to something real, real beings, a mind-independent reality of some sort. And the latter, the fictionalist reading, focuses on this normative strand, arguing that ideas are basically only heuristic fictions that guide us, but cannot really refer to something real. So my goal in a way was to reconcile these two interpretations and show that they both capture, or each of them captures an important aspect of ideas, but each of them on its own is incomplete.
So, Professor Katharina, I have another classical question in modern philosophy. What are the most substantial difference between the concept of cause and effect in Kant and Hume?
Yes. So perhaps we should mention that causality is not a central topic in my book, but rather it forms an important background to my work here. So for Kant, it is, of course, a central theme. Causality is necessary in order to understand what a thing is and how it interacts with other things. And Kant learns a lot from Hume on this question. So, and ultimately, as is well known, Kant claims that it's Hume who has awakened him from his dogmatic slumber, particularly with Hume's pronounced skepticism toward causality. Now, Kant and Hume are both extremely skeptical of the idea of causality as it's found in the Aristotelian or scholastic traditions, and as it's perpetuated in thinkers like Leibniz, for instance. So Kant shares Hume's skepticism about causal natures, and perhaps more precisely, he shares the skepticism about our human ability to recognize those causal natures. But it of course depends on how we interpret Kant and Hume in detail. But Hume is often interpreted as a skeptic about the very reality of a causal nature, and therefore is often seen as an anti-realist. So Hume argues that when we see the sun rise in the morning, or when we drop an apple and see it fall to the ground every time, it is merely our mind that habitually kind of connects these two events, the morning and the sun rising, the apple dropping down to the ground. And so it's us who habitually establish these connections, but there's those connections do not really exist in the objects themselves. So this kind of Humean conception, this Humean skepticism of causality, of course, leads to a very thin, probably even relativistic view of causality. So the relationship between cause and effect is what our human mind, habitually connects. It's not something real in the object. So Kant is fascinated by Hume's diagnosis that we cannot really recognize such causal linkages. But at the same time, Kant is appalled by Hume's relativity in a way, or his inability to explain any necessity that comes with causality. But Kant wants necessity. So the only source of necessity Kant can find is, again, our own human mind, or precisely our formal logical structure of our human mind. And so it's only due to our category, our conception of causality that's pre-established in our mind, that we are actually able to recognize necessary causal connections in objects out there. So in the objective order of nature out there. So this category of causation helps us to find patterns that are candidates at all for necessary connections in the objects. Like only on that basis can we find kind of an objective time series of events. His favorite example is the boat going downstream on the river. We cannot simply reverse the order of events there. It's kind of, we are necessitated to see the boat going down in one direction.
Great answer, Professor Katharina. So my question now is, what are the epistemic conditions under which a gentleman can be considered value within Kant's philosophical framework?
Yes, the validity question. So now we are coming to the more technical details of Kant's view. We've already seen that Kant distinguishes between these two higher faculties, the understanding and reason. And the understanding is typically what is focused on. So it's the capacity to judge, so its main function is to make judgments on the basis of the input we receive from the senses. So it may judge that this is a cup of coffee, or that the weather is nice outside. And now there are two basic questions we can ask about these judgments. And first of all, is what the understanding has produced really a judgment, a valid judgment? That is, does it meet the standards and conditions of a judgment at all? That's the first question. That's about the validity of a judgment. And the second question is about its truth. Is the judgment true? Is it a true description of the state of affairs in the world? Is this really a cup of coffee? Well, in fact, there's matcha tea in it, so it's not a cup of coffee. Is it really the case that the weather is nice outside? Well, you can judge it with your own eye, but I think the chances are pretty high. I kind of think it's really nice outside. So my point in the book is that the former, the validity, depends only on whether the judgment is well formed on the basis of formal conditions laid down by the understanding. That's something about the logical grammatical structure of our understanding. And these conditions is what Kant calls the pure forms of the understanding. But there's also an important twist there, that only if a judgment is adequately formed, it can represent something objectively valid. So for Kant, the conditions of validity are also the conditions of objectivity, as it were. What can be considered as an object of judgment at all. So therefore, the pure forms of the understanding, which define what counts as a valid judgment, also serve as the so-called categories of experience. These are also the generic categories that every object of experience represented in a judgment must fulfill. So otherwise, if a judgment is invalid, it cannot represent an object at all, or anything objectively valid that we could all agree upon and hold to be true. Yes. So, and for example, to go back to your earlier question about causation, maybe, so the category of cause and effect is a structural formal feature that kind of is a necessary condition for what counts as a valid causal judgment at all. What counts as a valid causal claim about an objective causal fact. However, as I said, this does not mean that when I make a valid causal claim, that claim is also true at the same time. So I may get the causal fact wrong. I may not actually judge that this is the actual cause of an event.
Professor Katharina Kraus, my question now is about the empirical truths and absolute truths in Kantian philosophy. My question is, how does the conflict between empirical truths and absolute truths unfold in Kant's philosophy? And do you want to extend with way? Can truth in the Kantian framework be considered relative?
Yes. Yeah, with this question, we turn to this topic of truth. My point in the book is that when it comes to evaluating truth, the understanding is fundamentally incomplete, and it requires the help of reason. And that's true already for our ordinary empirical judgments in everyday life about the cup, the tree outside of the window. And that is what Kant refers to as empirical truth. The truth of our ordinary empirical judgments, such as whether the cup is blue, whether the tree is green. Now, it is important to remember that Kant draws a distinction between appearances and things in themselves. So that is between objects as they appear to us in our experience, in our consciousness, and things as they are in themselves independently of our sensory faculties. That's a fundamental distinction that I think lies at the heart of what you call the conflict between empirical truth and absolute truth. So when I talk about empirical judgments, I mean the judgments we make about ordinary empirical objects, like the cup or the tree. And these judgments are necessarily based on perception we have of these objects. I see the cup and the tree with my eyes. These judgments about empirical objects is what Kant calls empirical cognition. And when we assess whether a cognition is true, we assess its empirical truth. But how do we do that? That's the big question. So in general, Kant holds a correspondence theory of truth. So truth is defined as the agreement or the correspondence between a representation and its object. But remember, according to Kant, we do not have direct access to things as they are in themselves. So we cannot compare our judgment with how a thing is in itself. We can only check whether our current judgment about the tree, about the cup, agrees with other judgments that we already have accepted as true, other trees, other cups, other blue things, other green things, and so on. So in addition to a correspondence theory of truth, we therefore need a criteria for evaluating truth. And this is where reason, with its principles of systematicity, plays an important role. So reason is the ability, as you remember, to view the whole, to grasp the whole. So reason requires us to consider the entire system of judgments. And only if a new judgment fits in with this entire system should we or may we add it to the system. Kant therefore also advocates what I would call a systematicity theory of truth criteria. And that is roughly, or can be roughly understood as a more sophisticated version of a coherence theory of truth criteria. But of course, this comes with a typical problem that every coherence theory has. Empirical truth remains relative, or at least revisable, as you suggested. If something is empirically true or not depends on the status of our current sciences, of our current theories, of our current conceptual frameworks. So Kant therefore recognizes that, at least in principle, something we could call absolute truth, the truth of a judgment, as it were, at the end of all inquiry. This is true, or this kind of, in the end, it can only be true if it captures the features of the real thing, of the thing as it is in itself. But that's obviously a much more tricky conception in Kant. So it's not something we really have access to, even though some interpreters have argued that Kant's ideas of reason give us access to the whole system or its absolute truth in light of things in themselves. I remain very doubtful about such far-reaching claims. But again, the important point I was making in the book is that even for empirical truth, we require ideas of reason because these are the ideas that outline the whole system against which we can measure and assess the truth of every single judgment. And yeah, so they establish that systematicity or systematic fit is a meaningful criteria of truth for Kant.
Great answer, Professor Katharina. Guy.
Well, I've been paying a lot of attention to your explanation of how Kant views reason and how he views understanding. And my economist mind started working at the same time, thinking about models and how, for example, you said that um, the category of understanding captures kind of like of a structure, if I understood correctly, and that just got my brain on working on correspondence between models and actual truths. And I think it's very interesting how Kant affirms the existence of things in themselves, objects independent of intuition and the categories of understanding, and yet maintains that we cannot know them. How should we understand, given this context, this apparent tension between realism and the noumenal and the limits of cognition?
Yeah, this is such a puzzling aspect of Kant's transcendental idealism. Like he affirms the existence of things themselves, but at the same time denies us any knowledge of them. So, and this brings us back to this basic tension I observed in interpretations of ideas of reason between the realist reading, according to which ideas just represent things in themselves as what's called noumena, like beings of the mind, on the one hand. That's why I called it the noumenalist reading. And on the other hand, fictionalist interpretations, according to which ideas of reason are required for the purpose just of systematizing our knowledge. But on that view, ideas cannot represent anything real. They are merely useful and heuristic fictions. So in my attempt to reconcile these two strands of interpretation, I have argued that that ideas of reason do both, basically at the same time. Thus, they serve two purposes: the purpose of systematizing all our knowledge, but also the purpose of focusing all our epistemic efforts on a common goal. And this common goal must be completely independent of our human abilities, independent of the human senses, but also independent from human intellectual faculties, the understanding and reason. It must be the goal that lies in a fundamental sense beyond human comprehension, beyond the human horizon, but kind of guarantees that things don't drift into the relativity of knowledge. So I've therefore argued that for the purpose of systematization, ideas of reason, like the idea of absolute space, for instance, in physics, or the idea of the soul in psychology, outline kind of domains of human knowledge so that they define the widest scope of what can be known in this domain, as well as the kind of objects and their generic features of material particles, or the generic features of psychological beings that can be found within that scope. But importantly, ideas also have this second function. Ideas help us to approach something absolute, something maybe noumenal, something that is as it is in itself and is not subject to the conditions of our human knowledge. And we may call this the absolute truth or the noumenal. This is not simply a series of empirical truth that can be ever revised at any time. Rather, it's what is the underlying ground that those revisions of our empirical truth, as it were, of our empirical models in the sciences, as you refer to in your question, that these models, as it were, are revised in the right direction. They go in the right direction, and we actually approach reality as it is in itself, independent from our limited ways of modeling reality in the sciences, for instance. So both these strands, the realistic intuition that ideas refer to something real independent of the human mind, and this fictionalist intuition that ideas merely serve heuristically our ways of cognition, are central and crucial. But it's important to note that they capture two different aspects, two different tasks, albeit tasks that are complementary. One needs the other and vice versa.
Professor Katharina Kraus, I like so much your book, Kant's idea of reason and self-knowledge and self-formation. When I read the part of your book, the metaphor of the horizon, I was truly impressed by the way you wrote about it. So, my question is, could you explain the Kantian's metaphor of the horizon? And how do the semantic and epistemic regulative functions of reason shape the boundaries of human cognition? And in what way does the Kant metaphor of the horizon illuminate this process?
Yes. This metaphor of the horizon is really at the heart of the book, and I really was fascinated by it as well. So it is the central metaphor for what I call Kant's perspectivalism. So basically the idea that all cognition for us humans is fundamentally limited to a particular perspective, the human perspective, or as it were, it's limited to the distinctively human horizon, the horizon that we all share as a species and that we cannot transcend. So it is quite literally what we can see as a species and given the instruments we have created, like the microscope or the telescope. But then metaphorically, it's what we can make sense of and about which we have formed meaningful conceptions and scientific theories or models. So in my view, ideas of reason primarily serve to outline this human horizon, like to sketch the scope, as it were, of this horizon. And this horizon is within which we can find cognizable objects at all. Like these ideas demarcate the totality of our human perspective, the universal human horizon, Kant says at some point, and beyond which humans have no cognitive access to any reality in itself. But importantly, so that's not the only metaphor. There's another important metaphor. And according to the second function of ideas I've sketched in my previous answer. So ideas have this second function to point us to something independent, as it were, beyond the human horizon, which Kant calls the focus imaginarius. So this is nothing we can really grasp, but it's because it's beyond the horizon, but it serves this important function as a placeholder for an independent reality against which we can measure the truth of all our theories, against which everything has to be finally assessed, as it were. So these are the two tasks and the two metaphors. And it kind of latches on to what you refer to as the epistemic or the semantic and the epistemic function of ideas. And maybe we can look a little bit more closely into this. So if we look at an empirical judgment we make about the world, then there are the two issues the understanding cannot really accomplish on its own, or on its own and on the basis of sensory input. First, the understanding cannot form empirical concepts on its own, but it relies on having available to it properly formed concepts, like the concepts of a cup, of green, of tree, of blue, and so on and so on. And this concerns the semantic function of reason. And second, the understanding, as we already discussed, cannot provide criteria for the assessment of truth. So that concerns the epistemic function of reason. And we've talked quite a little bit about it. So let me say a little bit more about the first, the semantic function of reason. So how do ideas of reason help us to properly form empirical concepts? And recall that reason demands systematicity. It demands that empirical concepts are formed such that they are valid not only in this current context, like this current context of my empirical judgment about the cup, about the tree, but those concepts are supposed to apply across all contexts in different spaces, in different times, for different human beings, for different epistemic groups. So ideas of reason, such as the idea of the soul, basically help us organize empirical concept formation within a particular domain or for a particular theme. So as concepts of a whole, they demarcate a domain of reality and hence the kind of being that we can find in this domain. And in some sense, we could see something like the idea of the soul as being the most general genus concept, under which all other concepts in this domain must fall, like all other psychological concepts that can apply to the kind of beings that are described by the idea of the soul. Yes, and so yeah, maybe I'll leave it here.
A great answer, Professor Katharina Kraus. I like so much this part, your work. My favorite, your book in the moment is the self-knowledge, the self-formation, the anatomy of inner experience. So guys, I read the questions only because it's complex and contains difficult roads due to my mother language, I'm Brazilian. So my question, Professor Katharina Kraus, is how does your innovativity account of inner experience in conjunction with the self-formation view of psychological personhood preserve the conceptual cores of another experience, willing remain responsive to this distinctivity, systematic concerns rising be the puzzle of self-reference?
Yeah, great. This question really goes to my first book, as you said, Kant on self-knowledge and self-formation. It gives me the chance to talk a little bit about this one specific idea, the idea of the soul, that featured importantly in this book. So the starting point was an observation I made about inner experience. That is kind of the experience we have of ourselves from within, like the experience of our own thoughts, of our own conscious states, of our own desires, of our own emotions. And there seems to be a particular puzzle of self-references. Like, what are we actually referring to in inner experience? Like, in inner experience, it seems that I, the subject of this experience, the one who is having the experience, refer at the same time to myself as the object of that experience. I'm the one who's having the mental state or the thought or the desire or the emotion. So how can it be that I, the subject of my thinking, am at the same time the object of my thought? That's what I meant by the puzzle of self-reference. And this seems to be a disparity with outer experience, like the experience I have of the cup or of the tree, of things outside me. So, so there is this disparity between inner and outer experience, but at the same time, we want to have some similarity. Both seem to be kind of species of the same generic concept of experience in Kant. So how can we make sense that they are quite disparate, but also similar in another way? And so the question became more pressing for me. What exactly is this object of inner experience? Is it me, or is it rather a single thought, feeling, a desire, a character trait, an inclination, like more long-term motivational reasons or general features of a person? So what exactly is going on there? And so this became a deeper question of what kind of being can actually have inner experience. Like, what kind of being can be the subject of thinking and at the same time the object of thought? And this is where my solution was to go to the idea of the soul and to a new understanding of what a psychological being is in Kant. It's not something that is simply given as something that is sitting there static, like this cup on my table or the tree that's standing outside, even though the tree is already a much more complex organic object, of course, because it's growing and changing and so on. But rather, like, a psychological being is something that is formed in the course of its own experience, in the course of having a conscious mental life with inner and outer experience. And so this is what I call the self-formation view of psychological personhood. So a person is not given as a whole, as at the outset of any experience, but it is exactly formed as a whole in the course of its own mental life. Now, here the idea of the soul comes into play because it serves as this genus concept, I already said, but it serves as this concept of a whole. It kind of gives us a sketch of what that whole should be looking like in the end. And so as we discussed, it outlines, as it were, not only the general domain of psychology, but it also outlines my human self-understanding, my understanding of my own self. And at the same time, going with the second metaphor, it gives me a projection of a placeholder of who I am as it were, a thing in itself, as a nominal metaphysical being, that may correspond to, in the end, to the whole of all my inner experiences. So this was my basic idea, and you can see how it kind of goes back to my general interpretation of ideas of reason, and how the two metaphors, the horizon and the focus imaginarius, play an important role there for self-understanding and human self-knowledge, and even self-formation, becoming oneself.
Great answer, Katharina. First, congratulations on your book. It's a complex book, but I like it. So guys, Professor Katharina Kraus, my question is now, for Kant, objectivity depends not only on the object or appearance there is represented, but also and fundamentally on the self-consciousness of the subject. Can you explain this puzzle account of objectivity?
Yes. Well, I don't know if I'm able to explain it, as we are hitting another yet super complex and puzzling part of Kant's transcendental philosophy. But I think it's important. It's a really important question, as we have discussed validity, objectivity, truth, science, and important notions. Now, where's the role for self-consciousness in all of this? And it's really very important. Kant emphasizes time and again that only because we are self-conscious subjects are we capable of judging at all. Because judging requires the kind of capacity of being held responsible for something, being held responsible to reason. And this requires the capacity to be self-conscious, to be conscious of the one who is able or who is held responsible to reason. In other words, we can only represent an object in an objectively valid way if we are the kind of subjects that can be self-conscious in the right way. So hence, for Kant, objectivity is not something completely external or independent, like grasping an independent reality out there, but importantly, he defines objectivity within the human understanding, or as I like to say, objectivity within the human horizon. And this is our task as a community of cognizers, finding objectivity within our species' distinctive horizon.
Okay, last question. It's my favorite question, but it's a very difficult read in English. So, Gui, read another question.
Just before questioning you about the next question that we are going to provide, you touched on something that captured my curiosity immensely. You mentioned about we have like this primitive understanding of like we have sort of a self-representation of ourselves, and I just bought a cat, and was observing him having like this primitive understanding of things that seems like universal for conscious or living beings. He knows kind of like very basic concepts of distance, what's the word that I'm looking for? Death, for example. He knows that there are some sorts of jumps that he cannot make, and as we were talking about like understanding, you mentioned like the structure of we have like structural knowledge of things. It captured my curiosity immensely when you were talking about reason, how there is something more profound, more fundamental, that it's sort of like the underlying logic of the structure that understanding captures. And it just I'm personally I tend to be more on on the British side of things when talking about understanding and epistemology, and I'm very moved and considering revising my beliefs after what you just said about cognition and understanding, because it makes so much sense. And to close our series of questions, we have this one about the hylomorphic reading of transcendental self-consciousness, and how can it be a key to what you call perspectivalism?
Yeah, let me just start out by saying, like, this is thank you so much. This is such a high compliment for a philosopher if we can help people think about things differently, as it were, or kind of think about things in a deeper sense, in a deeper way. And so I'm very glad to hear that you are finding my explanations of Kantian philosophy really inspiring for your own thinking. May even be in other disciplines. You mentioned your economic background, or you may study other subjects, not just philosophy. And I think this is really important, and an important mission I think we as philosophers have, to reach out. And in a way, that's also Jose's podcast here, is this idea of reaching out to people beyond the disciplinary boundaries. And so, yes, it's absolutely fascinating for me as well, and I'm very happy to talk more about this, of course, anytime. But to your last and again very difficult question, the hylomorphic reading of transcendental self-consciousness, and how can it be a key to what I called perspectivalism I see in Kant. So this idea that all our knowledge is in a way due to the human perspective. It is fundamentally formed by the conditions of the human perspective. It's fundamentally limited to the human perspective. And so a key interpretational instrument for me is Kant's hylomorphism, this very strange kind of philosophical technical term. It's in fact a Greek term. It's coming from the Greek hyle and morphe. So it's a theory about form and matter. Hyle, the matter, and morphe, the form in Greek philosophy. And it's obviously fundamentally inspired by the famous Aristotelian hylomorphism, Aristotle's theory of form and matter. But Kant has a very, very different theory of form and matter. And importantly, I've referred to the notion of forms a few times already in this interview, and importantly, forms for Kant are not in things out there. We don't know the natures out there of things. Forms are in our own mind. And because they are in our mind, we can know them, and they are kind of projected onto the world, and they help us to make sense of the world around us. But they can never kind of abstracted away. They are a priori in Kant's sense. So there are the forms of sensibility, for instance, time and space. I've talked about the pure forms of the understanding, the so-called category. The category of causation is one of them. But in some sense, we can also understand ideas of reason as pure forms of reason. And I've argued that we should understand his conception of transcendental self-consciousness, the kind of self-consciousness I talked about earlier, as a kind of form. That's, as you put it in your question, it's this, or in your comment, it's this very basic form of self-consciousness, and this very basic form of consciousness at all that we need, or any rational creature really needs, to make sense of the world in some sort of rational, reason responsive way. So, and in some sense, this is actually very important to complete the perspectivalist picture, even though I didn't even touch upon it in my short book or the short space I had available here. But let me explain it in a few words. So Kant's transcendental philosophy, it kind of means that we can only find anything valid. As I've tried to spell out, like this idea that we are limited to the human perspective means that even objectivity, what we find valid for everyone, all of our species, is something that is only available from within the perspective. But we are at the same time self-conscious of our limited perspective. And that's part of this self-consciousness, to be aware of our own limitations and of our standpoint in the world. So we have a perspective on things, but we also need to be aware of the fact that we have a perspective on things. And so it kind of prevents two extreme cases, Kant's philosophy. Like on the one hand, it prevents something we could call an unlimited absolute objectivism, such as the kind of metaphysics he's critiquing, like that oversteps the boundaries of human sense and proclaims that we can have knowledge of things out there. But it also prevents, in turn, something we could call a relativistic and also absolute in this sense, subjectivism. We're also not kind of trapped in some sort of subjective illusions where we can never step outside of, like, in a way, the Humean anti-realism. So Kant kind of tries to steer a middle ground between the subjectivism and subjectivism and tries to find, as I said, objectivity within the human horizon of a particular kind of thinker with self-consciousness.
Thank you so much, Professor Katharina Kraus, accepting my invite. It's a great interview with great your words. So, vielen Dank, Frau Professor Katharina Kraus, für Ihre Zeit. Bis bald.
Ganz herzlichen Dank. Many, many thanks for having me. It was my pleasure. And good luck with this podcast. It's a wonderful project.